Picture a small storefront wedged between a pizza shop and a dry cleaner in a strip mall you've driven past 1,000 times. A red sign. A logo you'd recognize instantly even if you haven't stepped inside in 15 years. That's RadioShack. At its peak, this company was pulling in more than $5 billion a year, running over 8,000 stores across the planet, and sitting in more American neighborhoods than almost any other electronics retailer in history. But just a few decades later, 2 bankruptcies, thousands of shuttered locations, a brand reduced to a website, and a handful of independent dealers holding on to a name that once meant something enormous. How does a company that introduced millions of people to their first computer end up as a cautionary tale taught in business schools? Stick with me, because the answer isn't just the internet killed them. It's messier, more human, and honestly, more avoidable than you'd think. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the entire arc of RadioShack, how a tiny radio parts store became a $5 billion giant, why it had every advantage in the world, and exactly how, piece by piece, it let all of that slip away. We'll cover the CB radio craze that turned RadioShack into a household name, the launch of a computer that arguably kickstarted the personal computing era before Apple got the credit, and the slow, almost invisible decline that turned a beloved neighborhood fixture into a company fighting for survival. And if you stick around to the end, I'll show you something that still exists today, a quiet, almost symbolic remnant of RadioShack that most people don't even know is still running years after the death of the brand you think you know the ending to. Long before RadioShack was a mall staple, it was a niche, almost nerdy little operation. Founded in Boston back in 1921, the company spent its early decades serving a very specific type of customer, the tinkerer, the amateur radio operator, the person who wanted to build something with their hands rather than just buy it off a shelf. That identity mattered. While most retailers in the mid-20th century were built around convenience and general merchandise, RadioShack was built around a community, hobbyists, students, engineers, and everyday Americans who wanted to fix their own radios instead of throwing them away. Unlike sprawling department stores selling everything from clothing to furniture, RadioShack specialized almost entirely in consumer electronics and electronic components. That specialization was its superpower. Walk into a RadioShack in its golden years and you'd find batteries, cables, switches, resistors, capacitors, antennas, and every obscure repair part imaginable, sold individually, not in bulk packs nobody needed. That single decision, selling components piece by piece, made RadioShack the default destination for hobbyists, students, and engineers who couldn't find that kind of granular selection anywhere else. If you needed one specific resistor to finish a school project or repair a broken amplifier, there was really only one place to go. And RadioShack didn't stop at components. It became known for its extensive selection of do-it-yourself electronics kits, the kind of thing that turned curious kids into engineers and turned bored adults into weekend inventors. This wasn't a company selling you a finished product. It was selling you the experience of building something yourself, and in doing so, it built a level of loyalty that mass retailers simply couldn't buy. Here's the thing about timing. America in the mid-20th century was hungry for exactly this. Electronics were becoming affordable, curiosity about technology was rising, and there was no big-box electronics superstore yet to swallow up that demand. RadioShack didn't have to invent a new desire. It just had to be the most convenient, most knowledgeable option in a market that was starving for one. That's the kind of positioning most companies dream about, and RadioShack landed right in the center of it, almost by accident, almost too easily. So how did a hobbyist parts store become a retail empire? The engine of growth was deceptively simple, and it's a masterclass in scalable strategy. First, RadioShack expanded its private label strategy in a way that most competitors couldn't easily replicate. Instead of just reselling other companies' products, RadioShack developed its own in-house brands, Realistic for audio equipment, Archer for accessories, Micronta for test equipment, and Optimus for speakers. This move did two things simultaneously. It let RadioShack offer prices that undercut national brands, while quietly protecting and even improving its own profit margins. Customers thought they were getting a bargain. RadioShack was actually making more money per sale than if it had just sold someone else's television. Second, RadioShack built a reputation for stocking things nobody else bothered to carry. Replacement parts for radios, televisions, and household electronics that other retailers considered too niche or unprofitable became RadioShack's bread and butter. That "we have the thing you can't find anywhere else" reputation is marketing money can't buy. It spreads by word of mouth, technician to technician, neighbor to neighbor. Then came the accelerant, the citizens band radio craze of the early 1970s. CB radios exploded in popularity, especially among truck drivers and hobbyists who wanted to talk to each other on the open road. RadioShack was perfectly positioned to catch this wave, and it rode it hard, selling millions of CB radios and accessories at the peak of the boom. This wasn't a lucky guess. It was a company that had spent decades building infrastructure and supplier relationships specifically suited to catching a moment like this one. When the CB craze hit, RadioShack didn't need to build new capability. It just needed to open the doors and let demand walk in. From there, expansion accelerated at a pace that's hard to overstate. During the late 1960s and into the 1970s, RadioShack opened hundreds of new stores every single year across the United States. It wasn't trying to build a handful of flagship megastores, it was blanketing the country with small, accessible locations. That decision to prioritize footprint over size would define the company for decades, for better and eventually for worse. And the product lineup kept widening. RadioShack expanded into home stereo systems, cassette players, speakers, microphones, and communication equipment, becoming at the same time one of the largest battery retailers in the entire country. Batteries alone, unglamorous, endlessly needed, impulse purchase batteries, turned into a quiet cash engine that kept customers walking through the door for small purchases that added up to enormous volume. This is how growth compounds. Specialization plus private label margins plus a nationwide footprint plus a habit-forming product like batteries. Put all of that together, and you get a company that could grow faster than almost anyone thought possible. Then came the moment that changed everything, and arguably the moment RadioShack should be remembered for above all others. In 1977, RadioShack introduced the TRS-80 Model I, one of the very first mass-produced personal computers in the world. This wasn't a niche gadget for engineers. It was launched the same year as the Apple II and the Commodore PET, making 1977 one of the most important years in the entire history of personal computing. And RadioShack was right there, at the table, alongside the names we still celebrate as tech pioneers today. What made the TRS-80 special wasn't just that it existed. It was that it was significantly less expensive than many of its competitors, which meant it introduced home computing to a much wider audience than the higher-priced alternatives could reach. Thousands of schools, small businesses, and households ended up purchasing TRS-80 computers, many of them buying a personal computer for the very first time in their lives. For a huge swath of America, their first encounter with a computer happened inside a RadioShack store. The company leaned into this fully, offering software, printers, monitors, and accessories designed specifically for the TRS-80 line, turning a single product into an entire ecosystem sold under one roof. RadioShack wasn't just selling a computer. It had, almost overnight, become an important early player in the personal computer revolution, a phrase that would have sounded absurd for a former radio parts shop just a decade earlier. By the early 1980s, RadioShack was operating thousands of retail stores across North America, its neighborhood locations making it one of the most accessible electronics retailers anywhere in the country. Throughout the 1980s, the company generated billions of dollars in annual revenue, cementing itself as a dominant force in consumer electronics retail. At its absolute peak, RadioShack's annual revenue exceeded $5 billion. A staggering number that reflected genuine nationwide popularity and an incredibly strong market position. By the late 1980s, RadioShack had firmly established itself as one of America's most recognizable electronics retailers. Its reputation was built on innovation, convenience, and knowledgeable customer service, the exact same qualities that had made it special as a tiny hobbyist shop decades earlier, just now happening at a massive, nationwide scale. If you had stopped the story here, it would read like an unbroken success. Sponsorship-worthy revenue. Cultural relevance. A computer product that history remembers as genuinely pioneering. There was no hint, in this moment, of what was coming. Nothing about this peak looked fragile. But looking back, the seeds of RadioShack's eventual struggles were already there, quietly, even at the height of its success. They just hadn't sprouted yet. The company's greatest strength, its massive footprint of small neighborhood stores, was also its structural weakness. Those stores were small by design, built for a business model centered on components and accessories, not for showcasing large appliances or bulky new electronics. This wasn't a problem yet in the 1980s. Nobody needed RadioShack to have room for a wall of televisions when its core business was resistors, CB radios, and TRS-80 computers. But retail doesn't stand still. As personal computers advanced rapidly through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, larger manufacturers with more sophisticated supply chains and bigger showroom partners began entering the space. Companies like Dell, Compaq, HP, and Apple. RadioShack's small format stores, so perfectly suited to selling individual capacitors, were simply not built to compete in a world where computers themselves were becoming the marquee product, and where customers wanted to see, touch, and compare full product lines in person. This didn't work yet, but it planted the seeds of something dangerous. A store network optimized for yesterday's product mix was about to collide with a retail world that increasingly rewarded scale, space, and selection. Three things RadioShack's beloved small-format stores structurally could not provide. By the early 1990s, the ground beneath RadioShack had shifted, and the failures that followed didn't arrive all at once. They compounded, one on top of another, each one making the last one worse. First, market shifts. The consumer electronics market of the 1990s had become far more competitive than anything RadioShack had faced before. Large-format retailers like Best Buy, Walmart, and Circuit City began offering a much wider selection of electronics at lower prices, all inside spacious stores that could showcase televisions, computers, and full appliance lines. RadioShack's small stores simply couldn't display these larger, newer categories of consumer electronics the way its competitors could. The very format that had made RadioShack so convenient for decades was now working against it. Second, competition eroded its core identity. RadioShack gradually lost its leadership position in the home computer market that the TRS-80 had once dominated, unable to keep pace with manufacturers building faster, cheaper, more powerful machines. And in response, through the 1990s, RadioShack made a fateful strategic pivot. It shifted its focus away from electronic components and toward consumer gadgets and wireless products. On paper, this looked like reasonable adaptation. In practice, it alienated the very customer base that had built the company's reputation. Longtime customers were disappointed as stores steadily reduced their inventory of electronic parts and DIY components. The hobbyist market that had defined RadioShack for generations was slowly, almost apologetically, abandoned. Third, reputation damage from within. The company that had once been synonymous with the place that has that one weird part you need was becoming just another gadget store, indistinguishable from its rivals. And the rivals it was now imitating had bigger stores, deeper catalogs, and lower prices. Fourth, the economics stopped working. RadioShack poured resources into selling mobile phones and wireless service plans, and for several years, this actually paid off. Mobile phone sales became one of the company's largest sources of revenue. The retailer partnered with major carriers including Verizon, AT&T, Sprint, and T-Mobile, turning its stores into de facto phone shops. But this strategy carried a built-in expiration date. As wireless carriers expanded their own retail stores, customers increasingly skipped the middleman entirely and bought phones directly from the providers. The shift quietly stripped away RadioShack's competitive advantage in the one category propping up its revenue. Layered on top of all of this was the rise of a force RadioShack had no real answer for: the rapid growth of Amazon and other online retailers, which fundamentally changed how consumers shopped for electronics altogether. Online shopping offered greater selection, customer reviews, and often lower prices than any physical store could match, and RadioShack was slow to develop a strong e-commerce strategy, allowing competitors to gain enormous ground online while RadioShack was still thinking in terms of store counts and foot traffic. Fifth, leadership mistakes compounded everything else. The company frequently changed CEOs and business strategies, creating inconsistent leadership and long-term uncertainty at exactly the moment it needed a clear, steady hand. Several turnaround plans were launched with fanfare and failed to reverse declining sales and shrinking customer traffic. Meanwhile, the very store network that had once been RadioShack's greatest asset became a liability. Many locations were positioned too close to one another, meaning RadioShack stores were essentially competing against other RadioShack stores for the same shrinking pool of customers. The company maintained thousands of underperforming stores well past the point of profitability, increasing operating costs while its margins kept shrinking. Declining sales made it harder and harder to cover rent, payroll, inventory, and basic operating expenses. Debt accumulated steadily while revenue kept declining throughout the 2000s. By the early 2010s, analysts widely viewed RadioShack as a struggling retailer facing a deeply uncertain future. The $5 billion powerhouse of the 1980s was, by this point, a company fighting simply to stay open. This is the part of the story where no single moment feels like the killer blow. Its market shifts, then eroded identity, then a phone business built on borrowed time, then online competition, then leadership chaos, then an overbuilt store network bleeding cash, each problem compounding the one before it, until the company was standing on a foundation that could no longer hold. By 2014, the pressure that had been building for over a decade finally became impossible to contain. RadioShack was reporting heavy financial losses, declining sales, and severe cash flow problems that could no longer be patched over with another restructuring plan. That same year, the company announced an aggressive plan to close as many as 1,100 stores in an attempt to stop the bleeding. But even this drastic move ran into a wall. Lenders blocked the full plan because of restrictions written into RadioShack's own loan agreements. Think about how remarkable that is. A company so financially entangled in debt that it couldn't even close its own failing stores without permission from the people it owed money to. The very mechanism that might have saved it was frozen by the debt that had been quietly accumulating for years. This was the moment the audience subconsciously knows is coming. There was no single scandal, no dramatic villain. Just a company so financially overextended that even the obvious emergency fix was out of its hands. When a business can no longer control its own survival decisions, the outcome is no longer a matter of if, but when. On February 5, 2015, RadioShack officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the United States. At the time of that first filing, the company still operated approximately 4,000 stores nationwide, a staggering number for a business that had just admitted, in the most formal and public way possible, that it could no longer survive on its own. In the aftermath, RadioShack reached an agreement to sell many of its stores to General Wireless Operations Incorporated, an affiliate of Standard General LP. As part of that deal, roughly 1,700 RadioShack stores continued operating, many of them reborn as co-branded Sprint, RadioShack locations, a strange hybrid identity for a company that had once stood entirely on its own name. Thousands of employees lost their jobs as hundreds of stores closed permanently in the fallout. But the co-branded Sprint strategy never generated enough sales to restore the company's long-term financial health. Consumers kept gravitating toward buying electronics online or going directly to manufacturers and wireless carriers, bypassing the middleman entirely. RadioShack continued to struggle with declining foot traffic and shrinking revenue even after supposedly emerging from bankruptcy. The restructuring had bought time, not a cure. Do you think this collapse was truly inevitable? Or was there a version of this story where RadioShack adapts in time and survives? And with the brand still technically alive online today, licensed out to independent dealers under the REV ownership, do you think RadioShack could ever make a real comeback? Or is this simply a name being kept on life support? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you want to see the next breakdown of a company that rose fast and fell just as hard, make sure you're subscribed, because this is far from the last story like this one.